Dawn bled through the canopy like smoke seeping through torn cloth. The air was thick, gunpowder, sweat, and the sharp sting of wet soil. U.S. Marines moved low through the ferns, rifles tight, breath steady. The jungle clearing ahead hid the sound of whispers. Japanese voices, panicked, hurried. Then came the shout, "Move!" A single flash, and the silence shattered. Grenades thumped. The world went white and brown. When the dust cleared, what the soldiers saw wasn't an enemy squad. It was a group of young Japanese nurses, their stretchers dropped, their hands trembling in surrender. No one spoke. The medic at the front lowered his rifle first. Behind him, someone muttered, "They're women." The word felt foreign here. Reports later noted that more than 3,000 Japanese women had served in frontline medical units. Less than 10% survived capture. These weren't soldiers by choice. They were the remnants of collapsing field hospitals, overrun as lines disintegrated. The women looked terrified, some still clutching bandages, others covered in mud and blood that wasn't theirs. Their commander, a nurse barely in her 20s, bowed stiffly and whispered something no one understood. A sergeant, mistaking it for defiance, barked an order. The Marines surrounded them, guns raised. But no shots followed. Instead, confusion thickened in the air like fog. The Americans had been told the Japanese would fight to the death. But these women didn't even look up. Then came the small sound, a handful of sand slipping through fingers. One soldier, trying to clean his hands of mud, tossed a scoop aside. The grains landed on a prisoner's bare shoulder. She flinched as though burned. More sand followed, deliberate now, not as mockery, but as a rough attempt to dry their wounds and remove lice. The gesture, meant as help, looked like humiliation. The women froze. The men, uncertain, continued the act, unaware of the horror building in those frightened eyes. "We thought they'd shoot us," one later recalled in an interview decades later. Instead, they stared. Under the harsh tropical light, their fear met the soldiers' confusion. Two worlds colliding in silence. The wind shifted, lifting the sand again. In that stillness, mercy looked a lot like cruelty. The grains still falling. That's where everything changed. The sand hit their skin like sparks from a dying fire. Under the noon sun, every grain burned against the sweat and salt already crusted there. The American soldiers thought they were helping, disinfecting the cuts, drying out mud, driving away lice. But to the captured women, stripped and shaking, it felt like deliberate shame. Their bodies turned stiff, eyes darting, breath shallow. No one explained. No one could. Language had vanished under the weight of war. The medic, still holding his canteen, hesitated. He knew the jungle infections spread fast. Tropical sores could eat through flesh in a day. The manual said dry first, sterilize later. So he reached for the sand again, scooping carefully, letting it fall like powder across an open wound. The woman jerked back, terrified. To her, it was not medicine. It was punishment. Reports from the Pacific Front recorded that nearly 40% of all prisoners developed infections within 48 hours of capture. The heat turned small cuts into death sentences. But in that clearing, numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the silence. Heavy, uncomfortable, human. One soldier tried to joke, breaking tension, but his voice cracked mid-sentence. The women didn't look at him. One of them, the youngest, whispered something that sounded like a prayer. "We didn't know this was mercy," she would later write. "We thought they wanted to burn away our pride." The scene blurred between kindness and cruelty. The sand stuck to sweat, to fear, to the fine tremor of hands that didn't know how to help without hurting. Someone shouted for medics. Another man, red-faced, dropped to his knees, trying to wash the grit off one woman's face with the same canteen. She gasped, then fainted. Her knees hit the dirt before he caught her. The medic's instincts took over. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, checked for pulse, tore open a pouch, and splashed clean water across her lips. Around them, the other prisoners watched, wide-eyed, frozen. The sand ritual ended there, replaced by a quieter urgency. The fainted nurse's breathing steadied. The medic exhaled, relief flashing across his face. But in that fragile pause, the rumble of an approaching jeep echoed through the trees. Military police, their engines growling closer, bringing new orders and old rules. The jeep screeched to a stop, kicking up dust that hung in the heavy air. The medic barely noticed. His focus was locked on the woman's face. Pale, half-conscious, sand clinging to her lashes. He unhooked his canteen, tilting it carefully. Water slid over cracked lips, pooling in the dirt beneath her cheek. For a moment, the war fell quiet. The Marines who had been joking minutes earlier now watched in silence, their rifles forgotten. He removed his gloves, against regulation, and pressed his bare fingers to her wrist. The pulse was faint, but there, relief flickered across his expression. To him, she wasn't the enemy. She was a patient, a human body trying to stay alive. He muttered, "Easy now," though she couldn't understand. The words carried something deeper than translation. According to Army field logs, a medic was supposed to carry enough medical supplies for 25 wounded men. But that day, he used nearly half his morphine and gauze on prisoners. Orders didn't cover compassion. One corporal frowned. "That's enemy stock," he warned. The medic didn't look up. He kept his hand steady, cleaning a cut that ran across her shoulder. Blood mixed with sand, forming a paste that glistened in the sunlight. He worked fast, heart pounding louder than the engine idling nearby. She opened her eyes, brown, glazed with exhaustion, and saw him. The confusion in her stare wasn't fear now. It was something stranger. She had been told Americans were beasts, that surrender meant degradation. Yet this man, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, looked more exhausted than cruel. Later she would recall, his hands didn't shake with hate. When she finally sat up, wrapped in a torn blanket, she looked around. The same men who had thrown sand were now fetching water and cloth. The absurdity of it settled like dust on everyone's faces. The medic looked toward the road, hearing another engine rumble closer. A jeep rolled into view, this one marked with the bold white letters MP, Military Police. They weren't there for medicine. They were there for protocol. The medic knew what that meant. Paperwork, rules, discipline. The moment of fragile empathy was about to collide with the machinery of regulation. He straightened, his hands still stained with sand and blood. As the MPs stepped out, the military police stepped down from the jeep with boots that crushed silence under them. One was tall, chewing gum. The other carried a clipboard that looked heavier than his weapon. The medic stood beside the recovering nurse, his hands still ungloved, heart still racing. The taller MP barked, "What the hell's going on here?" His voice snapped the air like a whip. The medic started to explain. Heat stroke, dehydration, infection. But the officer cut him off. "You're not authorized to treat prisoners, especially them." The word "them" hung in the air, sharp and cold. Around them, the Marines shifted uncomfortably. Even the captives, now seated in a line, seemed to feel the invisible wall rising again. Army protocol was clear. Prisoners were to be segregated by rank, gender, and nationality. Physical contact without clearance meant a report, maybe even suspension. But the medic couldn't let her die for a line in a handbook. He muttered, "She needed help." The officer wrote something down, lips thin. It was the absurdity of war, compressed into a single scene. Compassion becoming paperwork. One American soldier later recalled, "We followed every rule except the ones that made sense." The Japanese women sat motionless, watching this clash unfold. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Authority versus empathy. Rules versus mercy. Rules are rules, even for compassion, one would later say in an interview after the war. The taller MP turned to the prisoners. Load them up. Command wants them processed at the field camp before dark. His tone was procedural, detached. The Marines hesitated, but orders were orders. The medic stepped back as the women were lifted to their feet, their bare soles pressing against the hot metal of the truck bed. Engines roared to life. Dust and exhaust filled the clearing, stinging everyone's eyes. The medic shielded his face, staring at the departing trucks. He caught a glimpse of the nurse through the slats, her hand gripping the side rail, sand still clinging to her skin. He wanted to say something. Maybe, "You'll be okay." But the sound was swallowed by the engines as they crawled toward the horizon. Still, he couldn't walk away. He grabbed his kit and started following the convoy on foot, against orders, against logic. The road ahead led to the outpost, and to something neither side expected. The convoy lurched forward, tires clawing at mud that smelled of rain and diesel. The captured women sat shoulder to shoulder in the open-bed trucks, their thin blankets fluttering against the humid wind. The sun baked the metal floor until it scalded their feet. Sweat ran down their backs in thin lines, mixing with the sand that still clung to their skin. Every bump in the road sent a ripple through the line of prisoners. Small gasps, muffled cries, and the rattle of empty canteens. American soldiers rode in the front, rifles resting across their laps, faces set in silence. The medic, refusing to stay behind, jogged alongside the last truck for nearly a mile before an officer finally waved him aboard. He climbed up, breath ragged, dropping beside the fainted nurse he had treated earlier. From that high perch, the war looked strangely quiet. Jungle stretched out endlessly. Green, wet, and indifferent. Reports from similar prisoner transports in the Pacific described heat reaching over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, each truck carrying as many as 40 captives with no shade. Most lasted only a few hours before dehydration blurred their vision. One Marine looked back and saw a woman trembling uncontrollably. Without thinking, he took off his own jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The act broke a dozen regulations, but restored something wordless. The medic caught his glance. No judgment, only understanding. Small defiance, born from exhaustion. The women whispered among themselves, unsure if kindness was another trick. They had been told American mercy was camouflage, that humiliation always followed. Yet here they were, wrapped in enemy fabric, shielded from a sun that should have been punishment. Even kindness burned, one later wrote in her diary, remembering the jacket's heat. The trucks slowed as the road widened, the engines straining through swampy ground. Ahead, through a haze of heat, a line of tents appeared, the U.S. outpost. From afar, it looked like any other temporary base, canvas walls, radio masts, and a flag stirring weakly in the wind. As the convoy halted, soldiers jumped down, boots sinking into wet earth. The prisoners were told to stay seated. The medic glanced toward the outpost gates. Crates stacked, guards alert, smoke rising from cooking fires. The smell of coffee cut through the stench of diesel, and fear, what waited beyond those tents, would rewrite everything the prisoners thought. They knew about captivity. The trucks rolled through. The gate of the U.S. outpost, just as the sun began to slide toward the tree line. Canvas tents flapped in the sticky wind, and the smell of diesel mixed with something shockingly ordinary. Brewing coffee. For a second, the captured nurses thought it was a hallucination. After days of fear and filth, the scent of food didn't belong in their world. The Marines parked the trucks beside a line of supply crates marked Rations. One of them pried open a wooden box with the butt of his rifle. Inside were tins of beans, bread, chocolate bars. The prisoners watched in silence as the men divided the rations. Then, something unexpected happened. The captain ordered, "Half goes to the prisoners." It wasn't charity. It was procedure. But to those women, half a tin of beans felt like an entire civilization collapsing in confusion. Reports later showed that an American ration pack carried nearly 3,700 calories, double what a Japanese soldier typically received. The contrast was stunning. The women had gone from starving in field hospitals to eating enemy food under guard. They didn't touch it at first. One nurse whispered, "Poison." Another stared at the steaming mug of coffee, too scared to lift it. The medic, the same man from the jungle, squatted beside her and took a sip himself before handing it back. Only then did she raise it to her lips. The bitterness made her flinch, but she didn't stop drinking. Around her, the others began to follow. A soldier tried to lighten the moment, offering a chocolate bar to the youngest among them. She hesitated, then accepted. The first bite melted almost instantly, sugar hitting her blood like electricity. She looked down, eyes wide, then up at the man who'd given it. He only shrugged. "You look like you need it," he said softly. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. That night, when the guards rotated, the medic lingered near the prisoner tents. The women lay huddled together under thin blankets, whispering about the day, the sand, the ride, the food, the strange humanity of it all. A corporal walked past, lighting a cigarette, watching smoke curl into the dark. His face flickered in the glow, thoughtful, uneasy. That look would trigger a memory he hadn't faced in years. The corporal exhaled smoke into the darkness, and the ember at the tip of his cigarette glowed like a tiny flare. The scene around him faded. Tents, murmurs, the low hum of generators, replaced by a voice that lived in his memory. It was the same jungle, weeks earlier, but the sound had been different. Radio static and gunfire. Now he could hear it again. The broadcast that had shaped this war long before any bullet had. From deep within the Imperial lines, Tokyo had sent its message through the airwaves. Never surrender. Death before capture. That order wasn't just for men. It had reached the nurses, too. The young women stitching wounds in sweltering tents, sleeping 2 hours a night beside dying soldiers. They were told surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on their families that no prayer could cleanse. In those days, before the Americans overran the camp, the nurses had burned everything that tied them to home. Letters, photos, even the small paper charms from temples. Better ashes than shame, one later recalled. Out of nearly 3,000 female medics sent into combat zones, fewer than 300 ever returned alive. They had believed dying for the emperor was an honor. Being captured was worse than death. The corporal remembered finding their charred belongings scattered through the ruins. Ash still warm. Back then, he hadn't understood the desperation behind it. Now, seeing those same women quietly sharing food under guard, he finally did. They hadn't fought to live. They'd fought not to dishonor. The medic approached, noticing the faraway look in the corporal's eyes. "You okay?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "They were ordered not to live," he muttered, half to himself. "And we're the ones breaking that order." Inside the women's tent, the nurse who had fainted earlier sat awake, fingers tracing the fabric of her borrowed blanket. She still couldn't reconcile what she'd seen. Kindness from the enemy. To surrender was shame, she'd been told. But tonight, wrapped in warmth and exhaustion, she wondered if obedience was the real prison. Outside, the jungle stirred again. A bird's cry, a ripple through leaves. The corporal crushed his cigarette into the dirt, the last spark dying out. Inside, one nurse began trembling uncontrollably, her body shivering from fever or fear. No one could tell. By midnight, the outpost was a faint hum of diesel and snoring men. The guards walked slow circles around the perimeter, boots crunching on gravel, rifles hanging loose. Inside the tent, the women lay motionless. Except one. The same nurse who had collapsed in the jungle now shook violently, teeth chattering even in the tropical heat. Sweat slicked her forehead. Her breath came in short bursts. Fever had taken hold. The medic was roused by a whisper. A Marine poked his head into the medical tent. "Sir, one of them's not looking good." The medic didn't wait for permission. He grabbed a kit, pushed through the canvas flap, and entered the dim prisoner tent where fear had replaced air. The smell hit first. Salt, sickness, damp fabric. He knelt beside her, touching her arm gently. She flinched, but didn't resist. He checked her pulse, then tore open a packet of sulfa powder, sprinkling it across the wound that had started all this. The cut on her shoulder, still lined with sand. Her skin twitched, but the bleeding stopped. Slowly, he draped a wool blanket around her trembling body. She looked at him through half-lidded eyes, confusion flickering. Every instinct told her this was a trick, that mercy always hid a cost. Yet, when his hand lingered just long enough to steady her, she saw something she hadn't in months. Patience. "Rest," he said softly. She didn't know the word, but she knew the tone. By dawn, her fever broke. The medic sat against the tent pole, head nodding from exhaustion. Outside, the first light sliced through the mist, catching the outline of the American flag fluttering above the camp. For the first time, the sound of birds replaced the echo of bombs. Military records from the Pacific reveal that female POWs treated in U.S. field wards had survival rates close to 60%, compared to barely 12% under Imperial care. Facts the world wouldn't believe later, because they didn't fit the story either side wanted to tell. The nurse stirred, opening her eyes again. This time she didn't recoil. She reached up weakly, fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. A silent thank you neither of them could translate. Her tears darkened the wool blanket, one drop at a time. Outside, the night gave way to a quiet humming, a sound that would soon draw the attention of a guard on duty. The guard leaned against a post, cigarette tip glowing red in the darkness. It was the hour when even jungle insects seemed tired of noise. The outpost had fallen silent. Engines off, voices gone, only the slow rhythm of waves somewhere beyond the trees. Then he heard it, a faint humming from the POW tent. Soft at first, then steady. He frowned, stepping closer. It wasn't crying, wasn't talking. It was singing. The sound drifted through the humid air, fragile but haunting. Inside, the Japanese women sat in a small circle, their faces dimly lit by a lantern. The nurse who had been feverish earlier was awake, leading the others in a low melody. The guard didn't understand the words, but he could feel what they carried. Sorrow, distance, and a strange kind of peace. It was a lullaby, one they had sung to wounded soldiers who never woke up. Now, it belonged to them. The humming wrapped through the camp, reaching the men on watchtowers and medics half asleep in tents. One Marine later wrote in his log, "For the first time in months, nobody reached for a gun." The song turned the night soft. Prison camps across the Pacific were known for sleeplessness. 80% of POWs developed insomnia from heat, fear, and constant light. But in that hour, the outpost's lamps seemed gentler. The guard put out his cigarette, almost guilty for breaking the rhythm. Inside, one woman began crying quietly, mid-song. The others didn't stop singing. They just held her hands until she could breathe again. The medic, listening from outside, felt his chest tighten. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something dangerous for a man trained to dehumanize his enemy. When the song ended, the silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. Even the guards didn't speak for several minutes. The nurse lay back down, exhaustion overtaking her, the blanket still damp from her tears. The medic finally turned away, heading to his own tent. The clock read 0500. In 2 hours, the colonel would arrive for inspection, with orders to check Geneva, compliance. Whatever fragile humanity had bloomed tonight would soon be tested by paperwork and command. The first light crept across the horizon, washing over the barbed wire. The camp began to stir again. Louder, more official, less human. By sunrise, the outpost was already in motion. Boots stomped through puddles, tents snapped in the morning breeze, and the medic found himself lining up beside the others as a jeep rolled in. Dust swirled around the vehicle as a colonel stepped out. Pressed uniform, polished boots, clipboard in hand. His expression was the kind carved from rules, not emotions. He scanned the camp like a man counting flaws. The guards straightened, rifles firm against their shoulders. Behind them, the women prisoners huddled near their tent, eyes downcast, wrapped in the same blankets that had once felt like shame and now felt like armor. The colonel barked, "We're here to confirm Geneva compliance." His tone was clipped, bureaucratic, the language of regulation, not relief. The medic tried to fade into the line, but the colonel noticed him instantly. "You treated them?" he asked. The medic nodded. "With what authorization?" Silence. A few Marines shifted awkwardly, waiting for the reprimand. But the colonel didn't shout. He just sighed, jotting something down. "Rules exist for a reason," he muttered, half to himself. He turned to the prisoners, taking in the scene. One woman still pale from fever, another quietly folding her blanket. A few whispering prayers. They weren't the monsters his briefings had promised. He looked at the medic again, softer now. "They seem stable," he said. "Keep it that way." According to declassified field reports, only 5% of all Japanese POWs in the Pacific were women, and every camp that held them was flagged for constant oversight. Inspections were political theater. Snapshots meant to prove American morality to the world. But in that dusty outpost, what the colonel found wasn't performance. It was something raw and uneasy. Empathy surviving discipline. The colonel walked the perimeter, inspecting food stores, water barrels, and sleeping areas. He paused near the sandbags and scribbled a final note. Adequate conditions. Discipline acceptable. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Morale unclear." As he turned to leave, he called over his shoulder, "Red Cross is coming through next week. Keep everything presentable." The medic stiffened. He knew what that meant. Photographs, questions, exposure. The colonel climbed back into his jeep, the engine roaring to life. Dust rose again, coating everything. The tents, the food crates, even the women's faces. Behind the fading sound of the jeep, the medic exhaled slowly. Next week would bring outsiders, cameras, reports, and truths neither side wanted recorded. A week later, the outpost awoke to the low hum of engines. 3 jeeps and 1 truck rumbled through the gate, each marked with a red cross so bright it looked unreal against the mud. The American soldiers stood straighter than usual, uniforms crisp, boots clean. But beneath that polish ran a quiet tension. No one liked outsiders documenting what war really looked like. The visitors climbed out, 2 men in khaki, 1 woman with a camera hanging from her neck. Their expressions were calm but sharp, scanning everything. Tents, latrines, even the faces of the prisoners. The medic recognized the woman immediately. She was with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Her clipboard held the power to shape stories the world would believe. The Japanese women were lined up near the shade of a tarpaulin. Their eyes stayed low, hands folded neatly. The medic whispered to a nearby guard, "Don't stage it, just keep it steady." But the colonel wanted it cleaner. He gestured for the women to stand taller, the blankets folded properly. The scene became a strange performance of decency under the lens of a camera. The Red Cross inspector began asking questions. Are they fed daily? Are they allowed correspondence? Medical attention? The medic answered each carefully. Yes, yes, and yes. Though he didn't mention the sleepless nights or the fever that had nearly killed one of them. Then came the flash. The camera's bulb burst white, freezing a moment none of them fully understood. The Japanese women flinched, unused to the glare. One of them, the nurse who'd survived the jungle collapse, tried to hide her face. Another, younger, almost smiled, as if testing whether it was allowed. Records show that by 1945, the Red Cross had inspected 69 Allied-run POW camps across the Pacific. Most reports concluded that conditions were adequate, a word that carried both truth and blindness. They wanted proof the enemy could be kind, one Red Cross volunteer wrote later. After an hour, the team left. The colonel shook hands with the inspector, both men smiling for one last photograph neither wanted remembered. The medic stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the camera flash again. When the trucks disappeared down the dirt road, the camp fell silent. One of the women raised her hand timidly. "May we write home?" she asked through a translator. The colonel hesitated, then nodded. The medic fetched paper and pencils, unaware that one of those letters would outlive them all. The afternoon heat pressed down like a weight. Inside the small tent, that now served as the correspondence station, the medic laid out paper and stubby pencils on a wooden crate. The Japanese women sat cross-legged in silence, unsure what to write after everything they had seen. The translator explained the rule. 1 page only. No military information. All letters will be read before sending. At first, no one moved. Then the nurse who had survived the fever picked up a pencil. Her hand shook as she began writing in slow, deliberate strokes. The words formed like fragments of memory. "We are safe. Treated fairly. Do not worry." She paused, staring at the blank space left on the page. What could she possibly tell her mother that would make sense? Across the tent, another nurse folded her letter halfway through, whispering to herself in disbelief. They had been raised to believe capture erased honor. Yet here they were, alive, clothed, even fed. Her expression trembled between guilt and relief. The medic collected the pages one by one. Each note was barely a paragraph, stripped of emotion but soaked in meaning. Official records later showed that prisoner correspondence was limited to a single sheet, each screened in less than 30 seconds by censors. Every word was weighed like contraband. When the medic reached the nurse's letter, he hesitated. The English translation was simple. "We are safe. The Americans do not harm us." He looked up, eyes meeting hers. There was no hatred there, only exhaustion and something almost resembling trust. He walked the letter to the colonel's desk. The older man read it twice, jaw tight, before stamping it approved in bold red ink. For the first time since the capture, the medic saw a faint crack in the colonel's armor, a sigh that sounded almost human. Outside, the women watched their letters sealed into a pouch marked "Outgoing." They didn't know it would travel thousands of miles by ship. Through sensors and checkpoints, its arrival uncertain. But for a few minutes, hope existed on paper. "Maybe the war lied to us," one woman whispered softly as the sun dipped behind the tents. None of the guards understood the words, but they felt the tone, like the first rain after endless drought. The medic watched the courier load the pouch onto a jeep. Dust rose as it disappeared down the dirt road, carrying a truth the Empire would not want opened. Weeks later, the pouch of outbound mail reached a sorting office in Manila, a warehouse stacked with sacks of paper marked POW correspondence. Inside, American censors double-checked every line, translating and resealing what passed inspection. One letter, however, carried strange weight. It was written in delicate Japanese, signed by a name barely legible, Nurse Ito. The translator paused at a line that stood out. "We are safe. The Americans treat us with fairness." That single sentence made its way to Tokyo through official exchange channels, arriving months later. Japanese authorities opened it expecting propaganda, something to exploit. But the words didn't match the expected script. There was no bitterness, no coded message, just calm defiance against decades of indoctrination. Inside a smoky censorship office, a young official read it aloud. The room fell silent. "This can't be released," his superior said flatly. They stamped the envelope "withheld for review" and placed it in a locked drawer. The letter never reached Ito's family, yet rumors spread. Clerks who handled the mail whispered about a captured nurse who claimed Americans showed mercy. Copies were secretly made and circulated among medical staff in field hospitals. Hope was the real contraband, one post-war report later concluded. By early 1945, over 2,000 Japanese POW letters were classified as unfit for civilian morale. Each told a different version of the same forbidden truth: that surrender hadn't brought torture, but survival. In bunkers and aid stations across Japan, nurses began hearing fragments of Ito's words. Some called it enemy trickery, others wept quietly, clutching the rumor like a prayer. The empire's iron certainty began to rust at its edges. If mercy existed on the other side, what else had been a lie? Months passed. The war's tide turned. Cities burned. Ships sank. The letter stayed locked in its drawer, its ink fading slightly with each humid night. When Japan finally surrendered, the drawer was opened again. Not for truth, but for record-keeping. Among the hundreds of censored pages lay Nurse Ito's note, still creased, still legible. One clerk tucked it into his jacket before the papers were destroyed. He kept it, he said later, because it sounded too human to burn. Outside that office, the sound of ships preparing for repatriation echoed across the harbor. The prisoners were going home. The harbor at Yokohama was gray with fog and diesel fumes. Ships groaned against the dock as the first wave of repatriated prisoners shuffled ashore. Men in ragged uniforms, women in borrowed coats, faces pale from years without sunlight. Among them walked Nurse Ito, her thin frame wrapped in the same sand-stained blanket that had followed her through capture, fever, and transport. She clutched it tightly, as if its coarse fabric carried proof of everything she'd survived. The Japanese officials waiting on the pier didn't cheer. They didn't greet them as heroes either. For those returning from captivity, there was no parade, only silence and sideways glances. To be a POW was to be marked, a living contradiction in a nation raised on sacrifice. Ito stepped onto home soil to find herself a stranger in her own country. Beside her, another nurse whispered, "They don't believe us." She was right. The women's accounts of kindness, of medics sharing rations, of sand poured not as humiliation but as crude medicine, clashed with everything Tokyo had taught its people. Government officers took statements but never published them. Officially, these women did not exist. Yet word spread quietly. Some families received anonymous notes. "Your daughter lives." Others recognized faces in blurry Red Cross photos that slipped through the press. For every woman who came home, 10 did not. Japan repatriated more than 560,000 POWs by 1946, but for many, the return was only the start of another kind of exile. Ito found work in a small clinic near Nagoya, tending to orphans of the bombings. She never spoke publicly of her capture, though patients would sometimes see her pause when dust blew through the window. They mistook it for allergies. It was memory. In a private notebook discovered decades later, she had written one line in careful script. "They threw sand on our naked bodies, but it wasn't hatred that stayed on my skin. It was mercy and confusion." That line became her truth. Fragile, quiet, and utterly human. In a war defined by obedience and brutality, her survival became its own quiet rebellion. As the clinic closed one evening, she folded the old blanket one last time, placed it on the cot, and looked out at the fading light. The world had burned, but somewhere in that fire, compassion had refused to die.